Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. Well, thank you, Amanda and Maria, so much for inviting me. And thank all of you for coming today during these very unusual times. I really hope that you and your families are all healthy and safe. So as Amanda said, we're going to be talking about shorter and warmer winters, and I'm excited to share with you a few stories about research we've been conducting in New England over the last several years. I'm sure, oops, it's not, let's see. Okay, I'm sure many of you on this call already know that our forest ecosystems are being inundated by the effects of human activities, whether it's climate change, air pollution, land use change like urbanization, or introduced pests. But today I'm going to focus on how climate change is really impacting the functioning of our forests. And similarly, many of you on this call probably already know that activities like the burning of fossil fuels at electrical power plants or the driving of our cars or deforestation are all leading to the increase in carbon dioxide concentrations that we've been observing in the atmosphere over the last several decades. And this rise in concentrations of CO2 are directly related to the observed increase in temperatures we're seeing around the globe. But what might be less familiar, though I think this group is probably very familiar with the fact that winters are changing really quite significantly. So what I'm showing you here are temperatures from Hubbard Brook in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. We're very fortunate in that the Forest Service has been collecting long-term data from a variety of different measurements. What I'm showing you here are just winter temperatures from December to February over the last several decades. And what you can see if you just look at these winter temperatures is that they have risen about 2 degrees Celsius or 5 degrees Fahrenheit over the last several decades. And even though we get quite a bit of interannual variability, the long-term trend is pretty clear. At the same time that air temperatures are rising, I probably don't have to tell all of you that the maximum depth to which snow is accumulating in winter is decreasing. So over this same time period, the snow, the amount that it accumulates in winter has declined on average about 26 centimeters, and there are now 20 fewer days a year when snow is covering the ground compared to the past. And so we know that winters are warming faster than other months of the year, and we know that warming is associated with the shrinking of our snowpack. And this is not just affecting forest ecologists or foresters. Many people who rely on snow in winter are already seeing this, whether you're a ski resort owner, whether you're tapping maples for syrup. This is all over the news. This article just came out in October talking about New England winters are on the decline due to climate change. There's a new term called winter whiplash, where we're going from cold temperatures to suddenly 70 degrees Fahrenheit and back again within a week. And so it's really all over the place. And these trends are expected to continue. So these two figures come from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they provide projections for what our winter climate here in New England will be like over the next century. So what I'm showing you on the left is a graph that just gives you a sense of how much temperatures are expected to rise over the next century. And I put a white box around New England to represent the areas where I'm going to be showing our data from. And if you look at the legend to the right, air temperatures in New England are expected to rise another 5 degrees Celsius or about 9 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century. And this rise in temperature is going to be associated with the further decrease in our winter snowpack. So on the right, I'm showing you a map of the northeastern United States. The red line represents the geographic area where we historically get snow on the ground in winter. The white area represents where we're expecting to see snow on a regular basis by the end of this century. So all of the data so far suggests and point toward our snowpack continuing to decrease over time. And why is that important? Well, we know that snow acts as a great insulator. So on the left side, what I'm showing you is a forest that has a sufficient snowpack. What happens is that if you have snow on the ground, even if you and I consider it extremely cold and bitter, as long as you get a sufficient snowpack, the soils beneath that snow don't freeze. And I'm sure many of you have heard the expression, look at that beautiful blanket of snow. It's actually correct. It's actually accurate in that snow acts as a great insulator. On the right side, what I'm showing you is that even on a day that you and I consider mild, as long as air temperatures are below freezing and soils aren't covered by snow, they're more likely to freeze. And so it's this interesting dilemma that comes up that in a world that's getting warmer, we're actually expecting to see colder soils or higher frequency of soil freezing over the next 100 or 200 years. So as long as air temperatures remain below freezing in winter, soils are not covered by snow, we're likely to see more freezing. And Peter Grofman used this term, this phrase that I really like, that basically we're going to see colder soils in a warmer world. And the insulating properties of snow is not something that biologists discovered. Indigenous peoples around the earth have known for centuries, of course, that snow acts as a great insulator to make their homes and dwellings. But what we're increasingly recognizing is that with the shrinking snowpack in our forests, that could really start to have cascading effects on the health and functioning of our ecosystems. And so why should we care about soil freezing? Well, one reason is that all of the organisms that make their home in the forest floor in New England have likely been adapted to not being frozen in winter because they're used to being covered by a sufficient snowpack. So here I'm talking about things like the roots of plants and trees, microbes like bacteria and fungi, as well as arthropods, which is just a fancy word for insects, and of course small mammals that live beneath the snowpack in winter. And so anything that might potentially affect these organisms negatively, if in fact they do, have the potential to feed back to affect our water and air quality, since many of these organisms are responsible for many of the biogeochemical cycling that contribute to the filtering of our water and air. Another thing to keep in mind is that our forests are really great, they have a great ability to store carbon. And why does that matter? As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, you and I have done a great job pumping lots of carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere, but estimates for the entire biosphere suggest that terrestrial ecosystems can offset approximately 30% of fossil fuel emissions of CO2 simply by their growth. So as trees grow, they take up carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, they store a good portion of this in their wood, and that's a very stable form of taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it on land. And so another way to look at this is that in this diagram, this is just a generic forest with the arrow going in representing photosynthesis, which trees use for their carbon source. And on the right side, I'm showing you respiration, which all organisms, whether you're a plant, a microbe, an animal, do. And so whenever we're looking at how much carbon forest ecosystems take up, we need to take into account both of these fluxes. Now, in current times, we generally consider New England forests to represent net carbon sinks, meaning the carbon going in is greater than the carbon going out. And it's for that reason that we contribute to the total amount of carbon being taken out of our atmosphere to offset emissions from things like fossil fuel combustion. And so we wanted to really understand if our climate is changing, especially in winter, is it possible that a reduced snowpack and increased soil freezing could affect nutrient uptake by trees? And we looked at that because nutrient uptake is a really critical driver determining how much carbon our forests can take up. And ultimately, could it affect the total amount of carbon being stored by our forests? And so to answer this question, we conducted 2 snow removal experiments. So what I'm going to do today is share results from 2 snow removal experiments and then our more recent experiment where we're also warming up a forest. So in the 2 snow removal experiments, they were conducted at Harvard Forest, which is in central Massachusetts, and the other at Hubbard Brook in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. At each site, we worked in the dominant tree species stands. So at Hubbard Brook, we worked in sugar maple American beech stands, and at Harvard Forest, red maple red oak stands. So these are all hardwood species. In each of the experiments, we set up plots that were each 13 by 13 meters. We wanted these to be big enough so that we could center each plot on 3 mature trees. So this photograph here on the right just gives you an indication of just trying to give you a visual of how large the plots were. And what we did is for the first 4 to 6 weeks of winter, every time it snowed, we would remove snow from our treatment plots. So at Hubbard Brook, we had 4 reference, 4 treatment plots. At Harvard Forest, we had 3 of each. And the idea is this was a controlled experiment where our reference plots were not manipulated at all, but the treatment plots had snow removed for the first 4 to 6 weeks. And again, we replicated this at both Hubbard Brook and Harvard Forest. And so throughout the winter time, we wanted to see how we actually changed the snowpack. So in 4 locations in each plot, we measured the depth to which snow accumulated so we could compare the reference to snow removal plots. And we also measured the depth to which the soils froze. So you can see down here this white PVC tube. These are inserted in the ground and left throughout the year. And then in wintertime, we insert this translucent pipe here, flexible tube that has methylene blue dye. And I can't tell you why, but for some reason that dye moves away from air that's frozen. And so by marking the ground line, you can see this green tape here. So normally this tube would be in the ground and the green tape would be right here, well actually below this at the soil-snow interface. So when this is buried in the ground, it basically is surrounded by just whatever the ambient soil temperatures are. When we pull this out on a weekly basis, we can measure this depth right here, and where it's clear indicates that the surrounding soils are frozen, and where it's blue, it's unfrozen. And so to give you a sense, just to show that our experiments work, these are data that Patrick Sorensen, a PhD student in our group, compiled. This comes from 5 years of data. On the left side is Hubbard Brook. On the right side is Harvard Forest. These are dates on the x-axis. The y-axis is the depth. So anything above 0 is snow. Anything below 0 is how deep the soils froze. So let's look at Hubbard Brook first. These white circles up here just represent how deep the snow accumulated in the reference plots. The black lines represent the plots where we took away snow for just the first few weeks of winter. And you can see these values are not 0. One thing we did is after the first snow, we very gently packed down the snowpack so that after that, when we shoveled the snow, we wouldn't disturb the forest floor, and also so we can maintain the albedo or the color of the forest floor across all of the plots. So this is the snow that was left behind, and you can see we shoveled above this base layer for the first 4 or 5 weeks of winter, and then once we stopped shoveling, you can see the snow accumulated after that. In the snow, if we look at soil frost depth, this represents these white circles are the reference plots. And while we did see that the soils froze a little bit in the plots with a ambient snowpack, when we compare it to the snow removal treatment plots, we can see that the soil freezing was not only deeper, but lasted longer than that of the reference plots. So we did indeed find that with a smaller snowpack, we saw a greater depth and duration of soil freezing. If we compare Hubbard Brook to Harvard Forest, we see the same trends, that when we take away snow, as you can see in these black circled plots, the depth to which the soils freeze is much deeper and it lasts longer. But not surprising, the amount of snow in general at Harvard Forest is less than Hubbard Brook because of its more southerly latitude. But now let's see what impact this change in the snowpack and soil freezing had on the health of our trees. So what I'm showing you here are data that Annie Sochi and my group collected. She took roots, which are shown right here in this picture, from this forested stands, and she measured what we call relative electrolyte leakage. That's just a measure of how intact, or I guess the opposite, how leaky roots are. And we know that all roots are leaky. As you can see in the reference plots, we saw about 20% leakage. But what's interesting is when we compare the reference plots to the snow removal plots, and we use relative electrolyte leakage as a measure of root damage, we see about a 37% increase in root damage when the trees have less snow and more soil freezing. But how does that impact their ability to take up nutrients in the following growing season? So in this figure, what I'm showing you, this is Annie Sochi in this bottom left picture. This is a photo here showing how she kept roots connected to the trees and put them into nutrient solution, and she measured how much nitrogen the trees were taking up. If you're not familiar with nitrogen, just know it's an essential element that all plants, animals, microbes require. Plants get most of their nitrogen from their roots, and it's an essential element, of course, for them to live, but it's also really important as a driver of how much carbon they take up and sequester. So in this figure, what I'm showing you is the early spring of 1 year. This is net uptake of nitrogen on the y-axis. And if we compare, sometimes it gets off here. If we compare the reference to the snow removal plots, you can see about a 36% drop in how much nitrogen the trees took up in the snow removal plots. So that suggests that in the plots where we took away snow, we induced soil freezing, that led to damage to the tree roots, and then they took up much less nitrogen in the following growing season. And to our surprise, we found that this directly translated into the amount of nitrogen we measured in soil solution or leachate in the plots. So in this study, John Campbell from the U.S. Forest Service buried tension lysimeters in the plots, and he measured how much nitrate was in soil solution. So I'm showing you months on the x-axis. The gray shaded area just represents the months that we observed soil freezing. The white circles here represent the reference plots where we saw basically negligible amounts of nitrate in soil solution. And the black circles represent the plots where we took away snow. So you can see this great increase in the amount of nitrate in soil solution in the plots with a smaller snowpack. So we think what's happening is as the roots are damaged, they don't take up as much nitrogen, we see more nitrate in soil solution. And why do we care about that? We care because most forests, if they're functioning and they're healthy, they retain most of the nitrogen that's there. They just internally recycle it and they use what's there and they don't leak a lot. We know in ecosystems where nitrate leaching or runoff go up, that's associated with a lot of negative things, including the release of nitrous oxide, reduced forest productivity, acidification of stream water, eutrophication, which are algal blooms, and negative human health effects. And so what we found in this particular set of studies is that when you have a reduced snowpack and increased soil freezing, it not only damages the roots, but it reduces their ability to take up nitrogen. That leads to increased nitrogen leaching. But what about the carbon storage, which is what we really were interested in driving this study? Well, in this particular study, what we did is we took tree cores from all of the sugar maples at Hubbard Brook that we had been studying in our experimental plots. We took tree cores, brought them back to the lab, measured the width of their rings, and converted that to cumulative carbon taken up and sequestered in the tree wood. The gray area here represents the 5 years that we took away snow, again, just for the first few weeks of winter, not the entire winter. The upper line represents our reference plots. The lower line represents our snow removal plots. We coupled these measurements with leaf level measurements of photosynthesis, and again, this is the tree growth data that we use for this figure here. And what we found is that with a smaller snowpack and greater freezing, about a 40% drop in how much carbon these forests were storing. We also made measurements of stem respiration and soil respiration, which are just measurements of CO2 loss from the forest itself. And together what we found is not only are these forests sequestering less carbon when they're exposed to less snow, they're also releasing more carbon due to respiration. And so what did we find from our snow removal experiments? We found that when you reduce the snowpack and you increase soil freezing, that it does indeed increase carbon storage in our forests, both through a reduction in photosynthesis and carbon sequestration, as well as an increase in rates of respiration. When we scale these results up to the entire northern forest, where sugar maples are present, we expect this to lead to about a 15% reduction in carbon storage across these ecosystems. And so if I ended my talk here, you might be a little depressed. When we were at this stage in the research, I'd often get the question, wait a minute, all you've shown me is that winter climate is going to negatively impact our forests, it's going to damage their roots, reduce their ability to grow. What's going on? And that got us thinking that winter is not the only season of the year that's changing. We know that growing seasons are getting warmer, they're getting longer, and so more recently we've been really interested in trying to find out what are the combined effects of colder soils in winter and warmer soils in the growing season. So we set up our climate change across season effects experiment, which we now call CCASE. This experiment is only at Hubbard Brook. Just because of logistics and cost, we couldn't also do it at Harvard Forest. So this is an entirely new experiment, not overlapping with the snow removal experiments. And the idea is we wanted to look at the interacting effects of warmer soils in the growing season, colder soils in winter, on different aspects of forest health and carbon sequestration. So in this experiment, we have 6 plots total, 2 reference, 2 that we warm 5 degrees in the growing season, 2 that we warm in the growing season, and we would take away snow in winter. These are just some pictures that we have of the plots. The upper left figure shows you the cables that are buried in the forest floor. These are thermal images taken during the day, but you can see how the cables are spaced apart across the plots. And this is our enclosure that's housing our electrical equipment. To give you a sense that our treatments worked, this is showing you soil temperature across a 12-month period, but we see similar trends every year. This is soil temperature at 10 centimeter depth. The black line represents the reference plots, where these are just ambient temperatures. In the growing season, we warm those soils 5 degrees above ambient. And in the winter time, we remove snow, which immediately causes the soils to freeze. Then we turn on the cables to cause a thaw, and we aim to get 4 freeze-thaw cycles in winter, since this is what we're expecting to see over the next century. So I'm only going to show you a couple quick data slides here because we don't have a lot more time, but just to give you a sense of what we're finding in this experiment so far. We're also measuring root damage across the plots. This is a measure of, again, relative electrolyte leakage. And on the y-axis is nitrogen uptake by the trees. This is work by Rebecca Sanders-DeMott. And what she found is that when the trees, these are from the plots that have both warming in the growing season and freeze-thaw cycles in winter, the roots are not only damaged more, but they're also taking up less nitrogen, similar to what we found in our snow removal experiment. And so even though we thought that warming, oh, is there a question? Even though we see that warming affects the trees, in this case, it's not affecting their ability to take up nitrogen. Sorry, I just see the chat moving. I'm not sure. I should look at that.
No, don't worry about it. We'll address it after after David's presentation. Thank you, though.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so I'm just going to run through the last couple of slides here. And then I'll skip this one for time, but the only thing I wanted to end with was that we also measure carbon sequestration of our trees in this plot. We measure this 2 different ways. One is with litter fall baskets, where we collect leaves throughout the fall senescence, and then we also have dendrometer bands on all trees greater than 10 centimeter diameter, and we use this to scale up how much carbon the forest is sequestering. And so similar to the tree cores, we're using this as a measure of carbon sequestration in the forest, and this is years on the x-axis and cumulative amount of carbon that the trees are storing. These are the reference plots, so the good thing is these trees are growing. That's what the positive line means. When we warm the forest alone, we see that the trees grow on average 50% faster, which is what we expected. Trees generally like to be warmer in summer, just not too hot. However, when we add the effect of freeze-thaw cycles in winter, that stimulatory effect of warming almost completely disappears. And so while we see that winter climate is negatively affecting the forest, it appears if we take into account the warmer, longer growing seasons, it's not enough to offset that negative effects of winter, and it almost completely disappears in terms of the warming effect on our rates of carbon sequestration. So I'll end by saying that what we've shown so far is that winter freeze-thaw cycles injure roots and reduce their ability to take up nitrogen, which is really important for the health of our forests, and that these negative effects of winter are not offset when we warm up the forest in the growing season. We also see that growing season warming leads to greater tree growth and carbon uptake, which are both measures of forest health, but these are indeed offset by soil freeze-thaw cycles in winter. So we're now putting together a carbon budget for the forest, taking into account carbon sequestration and carbon loss due to respiration, to determine the net effect of warmer growing seasons and colder winters. But the jury's still out on that, but I'd be happy to share results as we go. And so in general, I'd say that winter injury to roots may constrain uptake of nitrogen by our trees, and therefore the total amount of carbon sequestered in northern forest ecosystems are likely to be constrained by what we're observing in the winter time. So just to end, just to mention again, there's lots of different things that are affecting our forests, and I think it's really important to take them into account when we're trying to understand the health and functioning of these ecosystems. And I just want to acknowledge that none of this work is done alone. There's a team of amazing people at Hubbard Brook and our group at Boston University and our funders. And after Dave's talk, I'm more than happy to take questions, but if any of you want to reach out, feel free to do that. My email address is right there. Thank you.
Wow, excellent. Thank you so much. I think at this point we'll switch over to David's slides and we'll get started, but thank you. And again, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box and we will address them after the presentations conclude. All right, go ahead, Dave.
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about management decisions we made over the last 20 years in a large ownership in Vermont. And also a small study we did comparing winter and summer harvesting costs. Obviously, my focus will be on the operation end, on harvesting, and changes that we had to make in regards to changing climate. And unfortunately, only touch briefly on the silviculture. We just don't have enough time. Next slide. So in 1998, the Vermont Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy partnered up and purchased a 26,000 acre ownership from the Atlas Plywood Corporation. It wasn't contiguous, spread over 17 towns, basically running along the Green Mountains, starting up at the Canadian border near Jay Peak and running south. There were a few outliers that we spun off, and those proceeds helped to get the project up and running. You know, these lands provide an opportunity for the partnership to explore the challenges associated with managing large tracts of timberland while balancing the ecological, economic, and social values associated with management choices. At the time, this was a big deal. I don't think either organization had ever entered into a partnership like this. Lots of meetings in the very beginning. Next slide. This property came with a very long history of harvesting. Interestingly, some of the individual properties have never been part of the extensive clearing that happened in Vermont when Vermont was 80% open. At its peak, Atlas had mills strategically placed around, and they made plywood for packing boxes. Before cardboard, they found the plywood was very strong and very lightweight. And with most industrial ownerships, you know, most of the high value timber had been harvested. Next slide. Here we go. So at the time of purchase, the stocking was between 17 to 22 quarts per acre. So pretty, you know, fairly good stocking, but, you know, over 50% of that was falling in that pulp and low grade sawlog category. So again, you know, to meet our financial objectives, you have to cut a lot of pulp to do that. Soils, sort of your typical mountain country. As you get steeper, they get shallower. Lots of steep ground, moderate. Let's see. We also inherited a ailing infrastructure. Most of the work in the past had been done, you know, they were thinking about today, not tomorrow. And also long skid distances. Landings have been pushed in as far as they could, and you just couldn't get any farther in. Let's see, in 2003, we became green certified through Smartwood under the FSC umbrella. And Fran Price at TNC and Robert Turner really shepherded that in. And there's a lot of work. We had to completely re-inventory the property. And of course, we had lots of other attributes we were trying to figure out. Growth rates, we had to calculate, a lot of modeling and that kind of stuff. But it was a very good process, and we all agreed it was a good thing to do. Let's see. Next slide. So I like to say 20 years ago, we were thinking about climate change. You know, that was one of our main drivers, but you know, it wasn't really in the news. We are certainly concerned about it, but really our focus was on restoration and creating a resilient forest. So kind of to do that, we obviously wanted to maintain our water quality, following all AMPs, BMPs. We also put no-cut buffers on a lot of the main streams, you know, identified vernal pools, wetlands, those kind of things. The property in general is somewhat just average, so we didn't have a lot of ecological hotspots. Any rare and endangered species we found, we certainly protected those. And the few stuff we did find was typically in areas we weren't harvesting, or harvesting wasn't going to have a detrimental effect on it. Coarse woody debris was a real big one. There wasn't a lot of research then. Most of it was out in the Pacific Northwest, so we had kind of a tough time trying to figure stuff out for the Northeast. We were one of the first managers that were actually recruiting coarse woody debris in terms of actually marking trees to be cut and left on the ground. We tried to get the biggest we could, so we tried to go 14 inches and up. The other thing we did on our legacy trees, if there are any large ones that have been left, most of them, there are actually a number of them, they're pulp quality. So anything getting up around 30 inches in diameter would never be cut. You know, only occasionally something that big would be cut. Our silviculture, we certainly, we felt that the uneven age management sort of maximized as many benefits as possible. So that was our overall goal, but it didn't mean we weren't doing some even age interim strategies to get to that uneven age system. So back to the coarse woody debris briefly. We also made the decision not to do whole tree harvesting. Our soils certainly could use a nutrient boost. We didn't have a lot of coarse woody debris, so certainly we're lacking in some habitat issues. And also operationally, this ground was just not well suited for mechanized operations. You know, big grapple skidders trying to get up steep ground just didn't seem to work well. A lot of residual stand damage in that case, and we just, you know, we're putting all this time and energy into that. We didn't really want to create more pulp. So, and also we really tried to focus on minimizing our roads and trails. You know, we wanted to grow trees, not grow trails. I put invasives in there. I think that's more of an issue now. Back in the early days, and even today, it's not that big of an issue yet, but certainly I think it will become one. Okay, next slide. So just want to step back for 1 minute here. When I came onto this project, I was very good at fixing problems. So if we had erosion, if we had washouts and that, I knew how to do that well. But in light of the climate changes, you know, minimizing our impact on the land and to get everything we wanted to accomplish, I really needed to be good at preventing this stuff, these issues. And this was a big shift for me personally, and often difficult because it had to, you know, no one likes change, and when you're good at something, it's even harder. And it wasn't just me, it was also the logging community. You know, I was asking them to do things and they'd just be scratching their head. So we had to think outside the box. We had a pretty good team that would throw stuff at me and would try these things. So I just want to, let's go to the next slide. Just want to go through some of these changes we had to do with, and a lot of them associated to the warming climate too. When we first started, almost all the work was done by cable skidders, and they're really well suited for this ground. You know, they can get up the steep ground. They're not, you know, they can go on these narrow trails. But we need a lot of cable skidders to get the work done in our winters, and the ground just didn't go well for that. We'd like to, almost every parcel, the access had to be upgraded before we could go in there. So financially, to open up different parcels in the same year was tough. So we'd like to move into one area, fix it up, get it going, and then harvest it. And if any managers are out there and trying to have different cable crews sharing one landing, is just kind of a nightmare. The other thing, I couldn't find anyone that owned more than a couple of cable skidders. You know, you didn't have anyone that had 5 or 6 or 7. So I was always a fan of feller bunchers, but most of the feller bunchers were associated with mechanized crews, and obviously we weren't pulling whole tree. So we had to get creative on that. We actually tried leasing one year, and that didn't work too well. We just didn't have enough wood to keep it busy, and it's hard to have machines parked. So we ended up contracting with other outfits that would come in and cut our wood. Again, it sounds easy, but there's always hiccups. You know, if someone else has their own job running, they're going to go to that job before they come to ours. You can't lay down, 100 acres of wood in the winter and expect to find it after 2 or 3 feet of snow. So it has to come in on a regular basis. But that was working. We used the cable skidders. We tried grapples a few times, didn't really work too well. And then one day I did a small job using a cut the length system. When it was unloading from the low boy, I was really worried that I'd made a mistake, but it kind of changed how I looked at everything from then on. The equipment, there's quite a learning curve with it because cut the length was really designed for softwood, and we were cutting hardwood. So the first crew I used didn't work out too well. They were still learning and it wasn't working. But the next crew I got, we sort of all learned together, and I pretty much never went back to the other equipment. The ideal situation or group for me would be a cut to length with a cable skidder to cut that ground that even the cut to length can't go on. The forwarder is just wonderful to have in the woods. It can move bridge panels, it can move stuff, it can move brush around, you can fill in holes, works really well. And certainly there are limitations. It can make just as much mud as a skidder can, and it does have trouble on the steeper ground. So we had to spend a fair amount of time rethinking our roads and how to do that, so we could do that. The next thing was, again, when I started, bulldozers were really popular. There are very few people that would ever bring an excavator into the woods. Dozers have their place, definitely. But one day I was working a landing, putting culverts in, and I asked the guy if he wouldn't mind going up in the woods to try putting some water bars in with the excavator. It's quite a learning curve on that. Excavator operators are used to working on flat ground, digging cellar holes, those kind of things, and now you're putting them on a 20% slope. So you have to make sure they have a good seat belt, but they soon replaced the dozers. They could get a lot more done and a lot better job. Let's see, next slide. Another real challenge was when we had winter, a lot of our stream crossings and some fairly large ones, any wet areas we could freeze in. We talked about Pam talked about the blanket and that stuff. Once you take that blanket off and you can freeze that ground in, a little bit of an art to doing it. Bulldozer works really well. Takes you a few days, but you could you could have an ice bridge, and then come spring that melts and there's nothing to clean up. Well, when I first started, we usually had our jobs going by Thanksgiving. We were moving in, we get through hunting season, we've got the jobs up and running, you might have some wood in the pipeline, get through the holidays, and you knew you had a good 2 months, 2.5 months of solid production. And that slowly eroded, as we've all seen. And even got to the point where we were having rain events, major thaws in the middle of winter, which just, to send a crew home for a week just was unheard of. And it was very tough. And of course, you want to try to keep going, but you end up making more of a mess. And we found that if you tried to keep going on your frozen trails and you damaged them, you couldn't, to try to refreeze those just never worked. So you had to go home, and that was just really tough. So we ended up using the bridge panels, went to a workshop years ago, and driving home, we said, we can build those. We built, for several years, we built our own. And then as they got more popular, we found a mill over in Maine that was making them, and we just couldn't compete with the cost. So we buy a truckload, tractor trailer load of them. They last for a few years, then you have to replace them, but they're really good. A forwarder is just great with those. You can put those on there. They can put them in. Sometimes you just need 2. You don't need 3 like we do in a skidder job. And you can be quick and easy. You pull them up and off you go. And then the slide on the right there with the dog, there's a nice crossing at the bottom there. We actually tried brush first, but there are bridge panels on that, and it's locked in there pretty well. Okay, next slide. Along those same lines of the bridge panels, I got invited to go over to Maine on an FSC audit as an observer, and I saw my first portable skidder truck bridge. And you can see in the middle there that actually that's a bridge and it unfolds lengthwise. And we thought about trying to make one ourselves, but not being an engineer, we decided to buy one. And it was probably one of the best purchases we ever did. You can move that in a day. It can be up and running. It's got the rails on it, everything. You know, again, a little bit of a learning curve to figure out how to do that without damaging it. But it's a great tool, and any larger landowner that can afford one, I would strongly recommend it. Again, we found a lot of times with the winters getting shorter that we could still work in the woods sometimes, but our town roads were getting posted. You couldn't truck on them. Our own haul roads were getting too soft. So, but we could still work in the woods if we'd gotten our panels in and frozen in and doing all that. And so we could keep pulling to the landing, but you can only do that if you can get to that landing in the summer. If you leave the whole tree length, you don't buck it up into the product, you can come back in late May or early June and do that without any defect and ship to the mill. So basically we made a decision that, thinking on a long-term perspective, that let's fix the haul roads, our main truck roads, fix them right, and plan to have them there for a long time. Of course, there's quite a cost associated with that, but that helped a lot. I think one of the hardest things for me to get around was this, the post-harvest and pre-harvest closeout. So again, after any job, you're going to send an excavator up in the woods to put water bars in, make sure that trail's put to bed, close your landing out, seed, and all that kind of stuff. But we found what would happen is we wouldn't get back up into there until things dried out. And by that time, the damage could be done. So we decided one day, let's try to do it beforehand. And I had a lot of trouble with that. The first trail we did it on, beautiful, had great water bars, the whole 9 yards. And the first hitch out just flattened every water bar. So we had to kind of rethink that. You have to freeze those in somehow if you do it, or if you're really organized, you can get to a year or two ahead of time to let that soil dry up and harden up. That works really well. You still have to go in afterwards, but we found when it worked, having those water bars in there would catch some of that early spring runoff, and especially if you get some early rains, and it really helped on the soil and the erosion issues. Okay, next slide. All right, so back to our study we did. The help of Nyack and Maria, we looked at, whoops, I guess we lost it, that's okay. We wanted to compare the costs of winter versus summer, because we knew we had to increase our summer logging if we were going to keep this going. So obviously, as we all know now, it's proven that we are losing our winters. The other thing I noticed too is these extreme events. It seemed like we were getting these rain events. You know, used to be once in a blue moon. Now we're coming, you know, several times in the summer. So next slide. We chose one parcel. We call this the Burnt Mountain Calville Brook Tract. I got about 200 or 300 acre area that I knew was good summer ground, but to get there was very difficult. We had to cross the Calville Brook, which is a very flashy brook. This area is a big sort of watershed, very common. Sort of the weather would kind of come up over the height of land and then would just dump copious amount of rain. I've seen that brook come up 2 or 3 feet in a day. Very difficult to keep any kind of crossings in. We had several truck bridges in there that blew out in the early days, tubes, that kind of stuff. So anyway, we found this area and decided we could split it. So we started it in the winter. Okay, if you want to flip, next slide. So we kept track of our costs to get up there. We did have to do a fair amount of work on the truck road to get up in there, but pretty standard. And again, this cost would be spread over several harvest seasons. And let's see. So next slide. This is how it looked in the winter. That was just brush. We pushed a bunch of snow in, but it wasn't holding up. It's hard to tell how big that stream is, but it's you know, it's a good 20 feet across, 30 feet. But that's what we used all winter. Took us half a day to do that. Next slide. This is how it looks after the winter harvest season. Very little disturbance on either side. Normally there'd be a big water bar on the other side, but I knew it was coming back, so we didn't. Next slide. So on the right are additional costs to get in there. So along the same lines as that foldable truck bridge, I just thought it was, we were really good at building bridges by then, but I just thought it was crazy to build a bridge that we were going to pull out in the summer, you know, at the end of the summer. So we said, why don't we build a portable skidder bridge? So we had a fair amount into it, but that was, we got that back over and over because we used that bridge in many places. And instead of having it fold up, we made it in two pieces so the forwarder could move it easily, and it was pinned together. Got pretty good at putting that in. 4 or 5 hours we had that in. We put the crane mats on top of it as decking, and you're all set to go. I think the next slide. Yeah, next slide. You can, next slide, there we go. Okay, so the slide on the right is kind of the bridge before we put the decking on. That was when we first had it. We had to modify it a little bit, but you can see we had two I-beams under each, you know, under the wheels of whatever machine was going over, and it's pinned together, and there's quite a bit of slop in it, so you didn't have to have your headers and all that perfectly level like you would on a truck bridge. So it would go in quickly, and it was fairly rugged. You had to be a little careful. You can see the forwarder in the background. He's got the wood. In this case, it's the first time we used it. We actually used 8x8 10-rack we sawed out. But again, it took a while. It was hard to keep that on the bridge, so we went to crane mats after that. And you can see on the excavator how when they have a thumb, they can take those big cement blocks and just reach across the brook and place them. In this case, we were able to not even have to drive through the brook with the excavator, which was even another plus. Okay, next slide. And this is the final shot of it on the approach down to the bridge. Put the straw in. We try to put logs and things like that in there to prevent ATVs and that kind of stuff from going through there. That's another thing on bridges also. On permanent bridges, one, you have to maintain them over the years, and this was a long-term ownership, but also it's access for folks that we do want up there, but also for the folks we don't. So by pulling the bridges out, it just seemed to work better. Okay, next slide. So just to kind of sum it up, certainly you can see in our costs, we were, you know, double coming back in the summer. But it's something, you know, we have to face, we have to figure that out. And I didn't really talk about the human side of this. You know, we invested quite a bit of money in our contractors, giving them additional training, working with us and doing things. And certainly contractors can't live on 2 months, working only 2 months out of the year. So with that, I think I'll end, and if there's any questions.
Great, thank you so much, David. So unfortunately, we only have just a couple minutes for questions. I'm going to jump really quickly. Andrea and Eric both asked about, I have a question for Pam about the tree species, age, and other characteristics that might seem to make some trees more or less resistant to root damage from soil freezing.
Sure, can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Great. Yes, so I didn't mention that. It's a good question. So the fact that we did this study at both Hubbard Brook and Harvard Forest allowed us to compare species. So we had sugar maple at Hubbard Brook, red maple, red oak at Harvard Forest. And interesting, what we found is the maples were both more sensitive to the soil freezing compared to the oaks. And there we think, we haven't been able to determine this, we didn't test it directly, but oaks tend to have deeper roots, and so we think that buffers them a bit from the soil freezing that happens at the surface of the soil.
Great, thank you. And we had a question for David about, let's see, well, one was, how much did the bridge cost, David?
I think at the time it was about 18,000, but they're probably in the 20,000 range at this time. And to build one on your own, you'd be looking at least easily 10, 15 grand. So.
Yeah, thank you. And then another question came in from Mila. She asked, it looks like a big success over the time of the plan for Atlas timberlands. Will you be continuing in the same ways, or what would you adjust in the near future?
I think invest in helicopters. So I don't know. It's you can only, some ground you can only go on in the winter. And so I think it's spending a lot more time trying to figure out what ground would be appropriate for summer harvesting, and just really keeping an eye on technology. I think the more tracked equipment we can use, I mean, there's some stuff that was used years ago that might come back around, but I wish I had a good answer, but I don't know. If wood got really valuable, my joke about helicopters would become a reality. But at this point, it's just, it's not feasible.
Yeah, thank you. We had another follow-up question from Andrea for Pam. She was asking, Pam, did you test what % difference those deeper equated to?
Could you clarify the question a little bit, like in terms of depth of the roots or depth of the snow?
We'll give Andrea a moment to type.
Yeah, no problem.
Yes. She says
I'm
yes.
happy to
Sorry.
follow up separately too, if you'd like.
I think it was yes to the roots and the depth of the snow, perhaps.
Okay.
Oh, so maples were 37% root injury.
Exactly. So we don't have like a direct relationship that's quantitative where we can say roots at this depth, so the deeper roots lead to like, I see what you mean. No, we don't have like we didn't create a relationship directly between depth of roots to root injury, so it's more qualitative in knowing that oaks tend to have deeper roots than the maples, because in a lot of our studies we actually dig out the roots, we can identify them by species. And it's just like if you brush aside the litter in the summertime, the sugar maple roots are right at the top, and then you have to dig down, not too deep around here, but to get to the oaks. So I couldn't give you a quantitative answer to that. You're welcome.
All right, thanks. And then Mary had a question for David. Is Atlas profit driven, so you have an allowable cut each year, or can you harvest smaller areas to maximize a shorter window?
Yeah, there's definitely a budget that has to be met. Certainly the silviculture is driving the bus, profits right behind it. So yes and no. I mean, we could open up smaller areas once the infrastructure is put in place, but it's a toss-up. It's hard to figure all that out.
Got it. Thank you. I'm sorry to cut off the last couple of questions that we had, but again, our speakers' contact info will be on the NIAC's website, and we're going to post the recording of this webinar as soon as we can, hopefully tomorrow, certainly by Monday. And again, I'd like to thank our speakers and thank all of you for joining us today. This is a really, really excellent webinar, a lot of great information and so much more that we have to learn about warming winters. So thank you for joining us. And again, I encourage you to contact our speakers with additional questions, and keep up your good work out there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.